The letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. I remember the sound the envelope made when I finally tore it. A small dry rip, like a barn door hinge that hadn't been oiled in years. My hands weren't steady. I set my scissors down twice before I trusted myself to use them. Outside, my husband Amos was hitching the buggy, and I could hear the horse stamping in the cold. But all I could hear inside me was my sister's handwriting, looping and familiar, staring up from the page after 4 years of silence. 4 years. That's how long it had been since Miriam and I had spoken more than a few clipped words at a funeral. 4 years later she chose a different church than the one we were raised in, and our family split down the middle like a log under an axe. I hadn't expected to hear from her again. Not really. Not the way things had ended. If you enjoy true stories about plain communities, you're in the right place. Let's begin. I was raised in the Old Order Amish, in a settlement in eastern Ohio where the roads still turn to mud every March, and the only sound at night is wind moving through the corn. My mother taught me to read peaches before I could read. My father taught me that silence was its own kind of prayer, that a still tongue and a humble heart mattered more than anything you could say out loud. We didn't use electricity from the grid. We didn't own cars. Our faith wasn't something you announced. It was something you lived quietly, the same way your grandmother had, and her mother before her. Gelassenheit, we called it. Yieldedness. You didn't put yourself above the community. You didn't claim to know for certain you were saved, because that kind of certainty smelled like pride. And pride was the one sin that could rot a person from the inside without them ever noticing. Miriam was 2 years younger than me, and from the time she could walk, she asked questions the rest of us had learned not to ask out loud. Why do the New Order families down past Sugar Creek get to keep their phones in the barn shanty? Why did our cousin Verna's family leave for a Mennonite fellowship 2 townships over, and still get invited to our Christmas gatherings, smiling, driving up in a car nobody mentioned? I used to shush her. I used to tell her some things you don't say at the supper table. She'd just look at me with that steady, searching look she had, like she was gathering something she wasn't ready to spend yet. There was a summer, I think of it now the way you think of the last warm evening before a hard frost, when Miriam and I sat on the porch shelling peas, and she told me she'd started going to sing 2 districts over, at a New Order church her friend Katie belonged to. I laughed it off at first. Singings were singings, I thought. Young people gathering, hymns, courting games, nothing so different. I didn't understand yet what she was really telling me. That same summer, our father walked Miriam down to the covered bridge for a talk I never heard the details of, and when she came back her eyes were red, but her chin was set in a way I recognized, Date's own stubbornness worn on a softer face. I should have asked her more. I told myself later that if I had just asked her more, things might have gone differently. But that's the trouble with looking back. You always think you could have caught the crack in the dam before it burst, when really you were standing in the same flood as everyone else. Good things happen too, and I want to tell you about them first because I don't want you to think this is only a sad story. In autumn Miriam turned 19 and she fell in love. His name was Elam, and he came from a New Order settlement in Indiana, out visiting cousins for harvest. New Order Amish aren't Mennonite, and they aren't quite like us either. There's something in between, a branch that split off from Old Order communities back in the 1960s. They still wear plain dresses. They still drive buggies, still farm without much modern machinery in the fields. But some New Order districts allow tractors for hay work. Some allow a telephone in the shop, not the house. And where we were taught to hold our hope quietly, never presuming to know if we'd be saved, New Order preaching leaned harder into the idea that a person could feel it, could know with a warm certainty in their chest, that they belonged to God. My father called that kind of talk prideful. Miriam called it peace. Watching her fall for Elam felt like watching weather change slow and then all at once. He had a crooked smile and patient hands, and he'd sit at the far end of our porch during visits, never pushing, just waiting for her to come find him. I liked him. I want you to know that. Whatever came after, I liked him from the start. The same easy way you like a good dog or a well-built fence. Have you ever watched someone you love start walking toward a door you were taught to fear? That's what it felt like watching my sister fall for a New Order man. Not fear of him, fear of the door. They married in the spring in his district, not ours. My parents went. I went. It was a strange, lovely day, the vows nearly the same words we use, the same kneeling, the same solemn quiet, but somehow the room felt lighter than our weddings back home, less bowed under the weight of not knowing. Miriam looked at Elam like she'd found the one still place in a windstorm. I remember thinking, watching them, that maybe this wasn't the crack in the dam I feared. Maybe it was just a different river running the same direction. Wrong turned out to be too simple a word for it. Or maybe I wasn't wrong exactly. Maybe I just didn't understand yet how deep that different river cut. The trouble didn't come all at once. It came the way most real trouble does, in small pieces you can talk yourself out of noticing. Miriam moved to Elam's district in Indiana, and at first the letters came every few weeks, full of small news, a new quilt pattern, a good corn harvest, a baby on the way. Then the letters slowed. Then they changed. She started writing about things she'd never mentioned before, about feeling for the first time, like she didn't have to be afraid of her own faith. About a sureness she carried now. A peace she said she'd never had growing up under our father's roof. My mother read those letters at the kitchen table with her lips pressed thin, and I watched something close in her face, like a door being latched from the inside. Have you ever felt like someone you loved was speaking a language just slightly different from your own, close enough to almost understand, and that almost was the whole problem? Then came the visit that broke things. Miriam and Elam came home for my parents' anniversary, and at supper Elam mentioned, easy as passing the potatoes, that their church allowed a phone in the harness shop now, for calling the vet for business. My father set his fork down so quietly it was almost worse than if he'd slammed it. He didn't yell. Old Order men rarely yell. He just said low and even that some lines weren't meant to move, and that every inch given today was a mile lost tomorrow. Elam, to his credit, didn't argue. But Miriam did. She said her husband's community wasn't compromising the faith, just living it a different way, that certainty in salvation wasn't pride, it was a gift, and she was tired of being taught to doubt her own heart. The table went silent in that particular way that isn't peace, but something waiting to crack open. I sat between them, saying nothing, the same way I'd said nothing my whole life at that table. What would you have done in my place? I've asked myself that more times than I can count. I loved my sister. I loved my father. I understood both of them, and understanding both of them meant I couldn't fully stand with either. After that visit, the letters nearly stopped. A card at Christmas. A short note when their first child was born, a boy they named Josiah, and I cried reading it, glad and grieved in the same breath, because I knew from the careful, formal tone that something between our families had gone cold. My mother started keeping a small stack of unanswered letters in her sewing basket. One she'd started and couldn't finish. I found them once, hunting for thread, and sat there in the quiet of her sewing room reading half sentences that never became whole ones. I'm glad the baby is, and there it stopped. We think of you often, though and there it stopped again. My mother was a woman who could piece a quilt blindfolded, but couldn't find the words to close the distance with her own daughter. Verna's name came back to me around then, our cousin who'd left for the Mennonite Fellowship years before. I hadn't thought much of her leaving at the time. Mennonites drove cars, dressed a little differently, some played instruments in worship, but nobody in our family had cut her off the way things were starting to feel with Miriam. I asked my mother about it once, why Verna's leaving hadn't broken anything and Miriam's had. My mother was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that tells you she's choosing her words the way you'd choose a stone to cross a creek. She said Verna left the church. Miriam left the family. I didn't understand the difference then. I understand it better now, though I still think my mother was only half right. Do you know what it's like to watch two people you love stand on opposite banks of the same river, and neither one willing to be the first to wade in? The years after that moved slow and strange. Miriam had a second child, a girl, and I only knew because Katie, her old friend, mentioned it at a wedding, careful and a little embarrassed, like she was handing me something she wasn't sure I wanted. I wrote Miriam a letter that night, my first attempt in over a year, and I tore it up twice before I managed something plain and short. I told her I loved her. I told her I missed her voice at the stove, the way she used to hum while she worked. I mailed it and waited. Nothing came back for 6 weeks. Then finally an envelope arrived with a return address I didn't recognize. Not Elam's district anymore. But somewhere new, somewhere farther. Inside was a note shorter than mine and strange. She said they'd moved. She said things were complicated with the church now too, that some in Elam's community had started drifting further from Old Order roots than even the New Order founders intended. Talk of joining more fully with a Mennonite conference nearby, sharing a building, blending worship styles. She said Elam wasn't sure where he stood. She said she wasn't sure where she stood either, for the first time in years. And then, at the bottom, almost like an afterthought, she wrote, I think Dade was right about one thing. Every inch does move. I read that line probably 50 times. I didn't understand it. Not for a long while. Why would she, of all people, echo our father's words? After everything that had pulled her away from his table, was she asking for help? Was she confessing something? I folded the letter into my apron pocket and carried it around for days, the paper going soft at the creases, and I told no one, not even Amos, because I didn't yet know what I was holding. The call came on a Tuesday, through the phone in the shanty at the end of our lane, the same one we used for the vet and for emergencies. It was Elam's voice, tight and careful, asking if I could come. My father had collapsed in the barn that morning, his heart, the doctors said later, though we didn't have all the words for it then, just the fact of him lying still in the hospital bed, and my mother's hand shaking so hard she couldn't hold her own coffee cup. Miriam came. She came within a day on a bus alone, leaving Elam with the children because there wasn't time to arrange more. I met her at the hospital doors and neither of us said anything for a long moment. We just stood there in that fluorescent hallway, for years of silence between us, and then she stepped forward and put her head against my shoulder the way she used to when we were girls sharing a bed, scared of thunder. That night, sitting in plastic chairs outside my father's room, she finally told me everything. Not in one rush, slowly, the way you pull a splinter, wincing at each small pull. She told me the real reason the letters had stopped wasn't only pride or distance. It was shame. She'd started, in that first year of marriage, to doubt whether she'd made the right choice, not about Elam, never about Elam, but about the church, about the sureness she'd once felt so strongly. And when the doubt crept in, she couldn't bring herself to write home, because writing home would mean admitting she wasn't as settled as she'd claimed the day she left, chin up, certain. She said she'd been ashamed both ways, ashamed to seem like she regretted leaving us, and ashamed to seem like she hadn't fully arrived where she'd gone. Caught between two rivers, she said, and too proud to admit she was drowning in the current, not standing steady on either bank the way she'd let us believe. Short sentences now because that's how she told it. Elam's district is drifting. Talk of merging with the Mennonite conference. Some families leave for full Mennonite fellowship. Cars in the drive, hymns with instruments. Elam was torn between his father's Old Order roots. For his family, too, had come up Old Order once, generations back. And this newer, looser fellowship pulling at the edges of everything he'd been raised into. She said she used to think the New Order path was a clean answer, a middle road between fear and freedom. Now she wasn't sure there was such a thing as a clean answer. Now she just wanted her family back, whichever bank she ended up standing on. My father woke 2 days later, weak but himself, and when Miriam walked into that hospital room, he didn't say anything grand. He just reached for her hand, the way he used to reach for the reins on a skittish horse, steady and sure, and said her name, just her name, like it was the only word he'd been saving up. She cried. I cried. Even Amos, standing quiet by the door, Had to look away for a minute. There is a kind of peace that only comes after a long silence breaks, and it doesn't come all at once the way a downpour does. It comes slowly, the way frost melts off a window in morning sun, clearing a little more each hour until you can finally see through to the other side. In the weeks after my father came home, my mother finally finished one of those half-written letters in her sewing basket, and she mailed it herself, walking the whole way to the shanty rather than waiting for someone to drive her. I don't know exactly what she wrote. Some things are still just between a mother and a daughter, and I've learned to leave a little room for that. I think now that silence isn't always the opposite of love. Sometimes it's just love that hasn't found its words yet. My family learned that the hard way, across 4 years in 2 church districts and 100 unfinished letters, but we learned it. Miriam and Elam didn't stay in that drifting district. They found a new order fellowship closer to us, one that had kept its footing steadier, and while they still hold beliefs different from ours, still speak of assurance the way our father never could bring himself to, the distance between our tables has closed. Last fall, she and the children came for the whole harvest season. I watched her show her daughter how to shell peas on that same porch, the exact same motion, and for a moment it was like no years had passed at all. I still keep that unopened turned-opened letter in my sewing basket now, next to my own mother's unfinished ones. I take it out sometimes on quiet evenings, and I remember my hands shaking over the scissors, not knowing yet whether what waited inside would heal us or finish tearing us apart. If you've ever waited on a letter like that, one you were almost afraid to open, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What did it teach you about your own family? If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe if you want more true stories from inside the Plain communities. There are more families, more silences, and more letters finally opened, still waiting to be told.